Oh, no, you're right.
So while we get this presentation up and running, I basically have I have like 3 small presentations in one, so I'm going to try and rush through them all, but they're all sort of surrounding nationally determined contributions and transport. But there's 3 pieces. One is just a little update on what came out of the last COP 28 on transport. Second is a brief review of a paper we did on the nationally determined contributions that countries have committed to on public transport. And then the third is a more broader look at NDC's implementation in 3 Asian countries. Do I just hit them?
If you just click, yeah.
So first off, just a brief review of what happened at COP. There was the global stock take took place at COP 28. This was the first global stock take to take place since the Paris Agreement launched in 2015. The global stock take was an assessment of how countries are doing to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. What happened in the global stock take final text? Well, we have a commitment by countries to double the global average annual rate of energy efficiency improvements from 2% to 4% every year. 130 countries also signed this pledge outside of the global stock take, but it is in the final COP text, which is called the UAE consensus. I'm going to get into what that 4% actually means, because there's some key transport elements there that I think we should know about. This second was that transport appeared in the COP text for the first time ever, really. And the note there was that countries should accelerate emissions reductions from road transport through a variety of pathways. Now that may seem kind of like obvious, and that should have maybe been there at some point before, but the fact is that that's pretty important that it actually was mentioned in the text. And previous iterations had basically said we should just electrify vehicles. And so the note on there being a variety of pathways is somewhat important sort of politically to signal that this is not just about electrification, but about avoid, shift, and improve. The lastly was this outside of the COP text, there was an effort by 60 plus global organizations to double the share of fossil fuel-free transport by 2030. 2 countries actually signed on to that call to action, Chile and Colombia. And we might expect some more countries to sign on to that coming out, but that is essentially an effort also to bridge this issue of there not being one emphasis on vehicle electrification, but that doubling the share of fossil fuel-free transport means you can do it through a variety of ways, through investing in bicycling and walking, through electric public transport, through reducing actually vehicle travel altogether. Any combination of ways are able to do that. So avoid, shift, improve is, sort of becoming clearer on the global the sort of high-level COP declarations. This is from the International Energy Agency. This is where this 4% on doubling energy efficiency comes from. You can see about a quarter of the 4% is coming from transport, actually. And IEA actually estimates that a lot of this needs to come from avoided demand, not just vehicle electrification. So there's a combination of efforts that need to happen. This is further analysis from IEA and its net zero analysis. You can see much of behavior change comes from low-car cities, where they're estimating things like public transport, shared mobility, biking, speed limits, parking policies, and the like, that they've kind of cobbled together into this estimate of saying, how this reduced or improved energy efficiency includes these items. So public transport really is actually quite a big part of what was a major commitment at the last COP. And I think there's some attention that needs to be paid to that. Second, this is the second piece. We issued about a year ago a paper on the role of public transport in the nationally determined contributions. Just a quick summary here. We found that about 100 out of the 142 NDCs submitted by countries, and including the EU submits one NDC, 100 mentioned public transport as a tool for reducing emissions. 55 of those promote a mode shift from private vehicles to public transport, but only 13 of them have specific targets about how they will do that. One example, India says it will shift 45% of road transport to rail. Bangladesh saying it will shift 10 to 25% of passenger kilometer travel from road to metro. So interesting commitments. Some countries commit to specific public transport infrastructure. Rwanda, for example, gets very specific, saying it will build 17 kilometers of BRT. Sri Lanka indicated it will build BRT on a specific road. So you have very vague commitments to very specific ones, and it's not necessarily that either is good or bad, but that's just what we're seeing. 35 countries have commitments on electrification of public transport. That includes electric railways, electric metro. 15 of those specify intentions to introduce or expand electric bus fleets. One of the, I think, good examples in the NDCs is Chile, which calls to electrify 100% of its public transport buses by 2040. And that actually is nice because it's aligned with the country's policies. And so you see, at least to some extent, with Chile being the leader in Latin America on electric buses. So just lastly, when it comes to adaptation in public transport, only 16 NDCs mention that. And then lastly, not seen here, we saw no NDCs mention informal transport, even though this is the dominant form of how people travel in many cities. So I put these slides in here, but you know, these NDCs are not necessarily aligned with what's happening. This is the growth of BRT. 2013, I think, saw 400 kilometers of new BRT. 2022 saw 90. You know, Guadalajara's BRT, Dakar, Senegal is about to come online. There's a few happening, but really there's not a lot happening. This is analysis that was done that actually excludes China, but shows we're building mass transit in general at a quite reduced rate since about 10 years ago. Electric buses, there's a good progress happening, but we need to have about 60% of electric bus sales by 2030. So there's really a long way to go in terms of what needs to be done. So NDCs are supposed to be submitted by 2025, new ones. And I think there's a lot of raised ambition that's needed, not just in the NDCs, which are just sort of saying this is what we'll do, but there's the complementing policies. So getting into that, we also just did a report on implementation of national climate action and transport in China, Vietnam, and India. This is part of the NDC TIA project that we're a part of with partners like GIZ, ITF, and some others. This is the report. We tried to assess how these countries are doing on their NDCs, but also the policies that aren't in the NDCs that are sort of backing them up. And then what are the more implementation measures in place? This is more like a political economy exercise of what helps in terms of implementing these things and not as much quantitative. But what were the key findings? Well, each of these countries has commitments for net zero. India being the latest by 2070, China by 2060, Vietnam by 2050. We looked at what kinds of policies are in place in each country around transport, so ranging from reduction in carbon emissions intensity, EV deployment, charging infrastructure, modal shift. For example, with modal shift, India was the only one that specifically committed to that, but much of these countries have a wide array of policies in place to implement transport decarbonization. So you can see sort of, this is, I'm not going to go into the detail, but our website has this report if you'd like to check out the more detailed analysis. Some of the key findings we found, one, that aligning long-term climate vision with medium and short-term actions in the transport sector is necessary. This is, some of these are somewhat obvious, but they're not actually evident always. Second, to ensure that transport decarbonization is not managed in isolation from other sectors. This means basically that transport ministries need to go and engage with their environment ministries, with the foreign ministries that are often in charge of climate negotiations, and vice versa, that those ministries need to engage transport ministries and others responsible for transport in a meaningful way. Third was to leverage multi-stakeholder platforms. This is, I think, for me, one of the biggest takeaways of this report. One example of this is the Forum for Decarbonizing Transport in India, which is part of the National Development Think Tank Niti Aayog, but it's been basically a place where these different stakeholders from different ministries can come together, talk about what's needed to decarbonize transport and move to implement these things. So it's having that actually dialogue in place in a formal way that can help. Fourth, focus on equitable and just transition. I think we're going to hear about that more today, so I'm not going to dwell on it. Fifth was transport requires a systematic approach. We're seeing this onslaught of attention towards electrification, but we can't let the attention to the avoid shift issues go away. We saw in the, for example, in the latest NDC round, much more commitments on electrification, but really sort of stagnant activity on avoid shift measures. Six was to craft an integrated and comprehensive policy mix for electric mobility, meaning energy sector, transport sector needs for addressing charging, things like vehicle grid integration. There's a lot of complexity in electric mobility, and the transport sector in particular needs to become experts at electric mobility, whereas I think if you're looking 5 years ago, even more, there was a sort of different cadre of electric mobility experts and different from the transport sector per se. Lastly would be to direct all finance away from fossil fuels. And I know this, I think, is going to be a big, the growing issue that's being discussed in the Paris climate process. Another, how do we get the finance to make this happen? Bringing in private climate finance, how do we de-risk investments into things like electric mobility, but also keep attention to investments in infrastructure. Just one example that we've talked quite a lot about, actually, that WRI has worked on is in India, where the nation's state power companies created what's a sort of quasi-governmental agency, the CESL, it's Energy Services Limited. So this is a private, sort of public-private agency that then purchased buses on a aggregated level for multiple cities. And by doing so, lowered the cost and also was able to put in certain procurement standards. So you're not only just buying in bulk, you're bringing down costs through standardization of certain procurement methods and the like. And that was a tender last year of over 5,000 buses. There's been further announcements by the government of India to invest further, But essentially the result of that was to bring the cost of these buses actually 30% or more below the cost of the traditional buses. So these are just the partners that we're working with on the NDC IA project, and I hope I didn't give a too superficial overview of what we're doing, but wanted to thank everyone for listening.